chapter 26. I'm going to start in verse 12. And while you're getting there, I need to pass out some stuff here. Yeah, Chris, take that one.
Thank you.
There we go. Matt?
Oh man, we only got 2 chapters left.
Yeah, after this one.
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah, we're narrowing it down here. So anyway, because Paul gets this big escort to Caesarea because there's a plot against him in Jerusalem, and he gets handed over there to the governor Felix. And he has a trial that ends in no formal decision, and then Felix decides to hold on to Paul for political reasons, and he hopes to have a bribe from him. And this goes on for 2 years, and they have many discussions between them. And at the end of this 2 years, Felix gets removed from office for failing to handle the conflicts in Caesarea very well. And his replacement is a fellow by the name of Porcius Festus. And he visits Jerusalem to talk to the leaderships there, and he rejects a request from them to hold a trial for Paul in Jerusalem. Instead, he required the leaders to travel to Caesarea for the trial. And so Paul then ends up having to endure a second trial, and that trial ends in his appeal to Caesar. And shortly after, Festus gets this courtesy call from King Agrippa II. And his kingdom actually didn't include Caesarea. His kingdom actually ended at the northern edge of the Jezreel Valley right here. So it included this area and the area to the east of the Sea of Galilee, at least at that time. He got a bigger area later on in his life, but at that time, that's where it was. After hearing about Paul's trial from Festus, Agrippa decides he wants to hear from Paul himself. And so the next day, Paul gets this opportunity to address not only Agrippa, but a host of other dignitaries as well. And Paul begins his speech with some background information that was designed not only to bolster his claim to being a devout, law-abiding Jew, but to provide a contrast between who he was and who he became. So let's go ahead and start. Matt, look, could you start in verse 12 or 12 through 18?
Yeah. On one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. About noon, King Agrippa, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads." Then I asked, "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, who you are persecuting," the Lord replied. "Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them, to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me."
So after all this, the background history that Paul gives him in the first part of this chapter, he then relates the incident that he had on the road to Damascus. And this bright light from heaven would have been recognizable by the Jews as representing the presence of God himself. And in his relating, Paul tells them why Jesus appeared to him, as it was told to him by Jesus. And he gives a little more information here than any of the other tellings. And Jesus tells Paul that he's going to serve him in a specific way. He's going to send him out as a witness of the things that he had seen and of those things that Jesus would reveal to him in the future. It's like Paul is saying to them, here is a guy that I firmly believe to be dead, telling me he's going to send me out as his messenger. And I know what I saw, and it changed the course of my life. So when we come face to face with the Son of God, it is intended to be a life-changing event. Now, Jesus also tells Paul he will be protected, and not that he won't suffer hardships, because earlier he plainly told him that he would suffer. Now, here's what his witnessing was to accomplish, as they're listed here. There's several things that Paul lists. It will open their eyes, it will turn them from darkness to light, bring them out from under the power of Satan to the power of God. They will receive forgiveness from their sins and put them in a whole new place with those who are sanctified, and all of that because of their faith in Jesus. And that's a pretty good gospel presentation. And those Jews present there would probably have recalled the words from Isaiah. So who did I give Isaiah 42:6 to?
Me.
Okay.
I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you. And I will appoint you as a covenant to the people and a light to the nations, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the dungeon, and those who dwell in darkness from the prison.
Okay. All right, so the Jews would have recognized that passage, and it had a lot to do with what Paul had just told them. Now, both forgiveness and sanctification are key themes in Paul's preaching as they appear in his letters. And here's one example of that. That was Colossians 1:13 and 14. Who did I give that?
Oh,
Give
sorry,
that
that's
to you,
me.
Chris.
All right, Colossians 1:13 to 14.
Mhm.
Okie doke. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins.
And so that's kind of a theme that you'll see all the way through Paul's letters. All right, there, you want to read 19 through 23?
And this is 26, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Consequently, King Agrippa, I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision, but kept declaring both to those of Damascus first, and also at Jerusalem, and then throughout all the region of Judea, and should repent, and even to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds appropriate to repentance. How far do you want me to go?
23.
Through it?
Yeah, up through and including 23.
Thank you. For this reason, some Jews seized me in the temple and tried to put me to death. And so, having obtained help from God, I stand to this day testifying both to small and great, stating nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place, that Christ was to suffer, and that by reason of his resurrection from the dead, he should be the first to proclaim light both to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles.
So Paul states that he just did what he was told to do in his vision. And he wasn't about to disobey instructions that came directly from God himself. And obviously it made quite an impression on him to reroute his entire purpose in life and going from a prosecutor to an advocate. And this is the effect the gospel is intended to have on people, to change them from the inside out. And notice the phrase here, performing deeds in keeping with their repentance. And again, as we talked previously, this is an Eastern thing. Good works was the expected outcome of one with a repentant heart. One isn't saved by the good deeds, but they are the expected result of them. And repentance is turning away from one thing and toward another. And that other here is toward following Jesus to a better life. Now, Paul finishes up his speech with the statement that he has done what the prophets had foretold as recorded in their writings. And this is to present Jesus as a suffering Messiah, risen from the dead, and bringing light to both Jews and Gentiles. Okay, April, you want to read 24 through 29?
Now as he thus made his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad. But he said, I am not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason. For the king, before whom I also speak freely, knows these things, for I am convinced that none of these things escapes his attention, since this was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know what you believe. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me today might become both almost and altogether such as I am, except for these chains.
Festus appears to interrupt Paul's speech, and at this point I believe he doesn't think Paul is any kind of a threat, that he's just nuts. And remember, Festus is completely Roman, and being completely unfamiliar with any of this, it sounds like Paul, to him, like Paul was just crazy. And Paul's response is to tell Festus that Agrippa would know what he was saying wasn't completely unreasonable. The Greek here word, the Greek reasonable would mean the opposite of madness. And because Agrippa would not only be familiar with the prophets, but also aware of Paul's and the church's recent history. And Festus might have had an excuse because of his ignorance of these things, but not Agrippa. He would have no excuse. Now, one commentator suggested that Paul was about to explain to them what the prophets foretold about the coming Messiah, but he was interrupted by Agrippa. And the same commentator also suggested that Agrippa knew where Paul's message was heading, and he didn't want to hear the rest of it. Now, Paul's response to this is to proclaim that his hope is to see everyone within his hearing that day become a believer. And I can just imagine Paul holding up his chains and saying, all except for these chains, which should not have been put on me in the first place. Paul's response should be every believer's desire, because not only is the unbeliever facing a very unpleasant eternity, but he's missing the life God has for them in the here and now. Right, Rick, would you read 30 through 32, please?
The king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice, and those sitting with them. They left the room, and while talking with one another, they said, this man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment. Agrippa said to Festus, this man would have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar.
So with that, the king and Festus and their entourage depart. And after they leave the hall, they agree with one another that Paul should have been released because there was no law against being nuts and no evidence of any wrongdoing against Rome. And so, but an appeal to Caesar was an appeal to Caesar, and they weren't going to dismiss the charges. So Paul's going to get his desire to go to Rome, and although not exactly the way he had envisioned. Right, chapter 27. And we're to you, Chris. Could you read, well, and before we get to there, just some introduction here to the chapter. This chapter covers the trip by sea from Caesarea, which here, Caesarea is about right here, right here. It covers that, the journey from here up through here and all the way, you're not going to be able to see it, but all the way to the island of Malta.
Oh.
Just go over here, it's off the southern tip of Italy. So it's going to cover that whole thing. And it reads like an exciting adventure story, which is exactly what it is. And I love this chapter. It would have made a great movie. But it's more than just an adventure story, really. It's a story of a God who faithfully fulfills his promises and his purposes, and of a man who has complete faith and dependence on God, even through circumstances that seem hopeless.
One question,
Yes.
but isn't this Italy?
No, that's Greece.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
yeah,
right, 'cause
Italy,
they're over
Italy's off,
here.
Italy's clear off the
I was
map.
like,
Yeah,
wait,
they fall
what?
off, they fell off the edge of the world.
Oh, I can't say I'm surprised.
Okay, you wanna read, verses 1 through 8, Chris?
Yep. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Andromitium,
Close enough.
okay, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Our Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonia,
Thessalonica, yeah, Thessalonia.
was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in his kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Sicily, Sicilia, and Pamphylia,
You got all the
we
good ones.
landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow and headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off
Canidas, yeah.
When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite of Solomon.
Yeah, Salmone,
Oh,
yeah.
how far do you want me to go?
One more verse.
Oh, okay. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea.
Okay.
Of course you gave me the complicated with all the big words, Mike.
You know, you just pronounce them the way you think and nobody's gonna be able to tell you otherwise.
I know, whatever. Whatever.
You got them well below there.
No, you did, you got them. I don't think there's, I think that might be one of the worst chapters in the entire book. But I read that those who are experts in geography and weather patterns in this part of the world contend that this is a remarkably accurate account of the journey. And we note that the we here in these verses, because Luke's on board. And so we're getting an eyewitness account of what happened here. And the fact that there was a centurion on board indicates there were quite a few other prisoners. Either that or Paul was a high-profile prisoner, even though he appeared to be under fairly light security, as we'll see. Now, there's a reason why Luke includes this centurion as a member of the Augustan regiment. This was a crack regiment made up of all Romans, no foreigners, and they were hand-picked from Italy, and they were often given special assignments for the emperor. Now, Luke is telling us here that either Paul is considered as a priority prisoner or this batch of prisoners is. So there was something special about them. Now, this ship that Paul and his Roman escorts and his companions board is one of those coasters, again, that we talked about earlier, that they travel close in to the shore, and they unload cargo at frequent spots along the way. Now, this ship is from Andromitium, which is up here, right up here, not all that far from Troas. It's right here. So probably the ship was on its way home. Now, there's no such thing as a passenger vessel in those days. There's no Love Boat, there's no Holland Cruise Line. Okay? The ship was either a warship or it was a cargo vessel. And passengers were incidental, and they had to even provide for their own food, and they usually slept on the deck. But Paul, being a prisoner, likely had his food provided by Rome, but his companions more than likely had to provide for themselves. Now you might remember this Aristarchus from the incident in the theater in Ephesus, and he was also in the advance party that Paul sent on ahead of him to Troas. And he must have been a pretty devout follower to still be with Paul through all of this years later. And I guess when God gives you a mission, it's your mission. And you don't abandon it until God tells you to. And apparently this Aristarchus believed that God hadn't released him from this mission yet. Now, according to Roman law, prominent Roman citizens under arrest were permitted to take 1 or 2 slaves with them to care for their personal needs. So there's speculation that Luke and Aristarchus actually went as Paul's slaves, and that's dedication. Now, the first port of call is the city of Sidon, which is where they started Caesarea. And the first port of call is Sidon, which is up in what is now modern Lebanon. And according to, since loading and unloading cargo could take days, it wasn't necessary or even desirable for passengers to remain on board, and from these ports they could resupply. And allowing Paul to go to friends and be cared for them by them is an indication of the life security. And also by doing so, there's one less mouth to feed for the centurion. But it doesn't say that Paul was without soldiers' escort, so we can't assume that he was just turned loose here. And Paul and company are starting this voyage a bit late in the year, and it's sometime around the middle of September. And in this part of the world, sailing from mid-September to mid-November was hazardous due to the weather. But if the reward was worth the risk, some ships' owners would take that chance. But from mid-November to early March, sailing was downright deadly, and ships rarely sailed during that time. Now, in the spring and summer months, the winds were favorable for this voyage, but in the fall and winter, the winds were predominantly from the northwest, and they were quite strong. Now to sail against the wind, which they would have to do during this voyage, would require them to sail a zigzag pattern called tacking. I don't know if you're familiar with sailing, but that's how they would do that. Now, the problem was that ships in those days usually had one great big square sail. And some of the larger ships might have had a smaller triangular sail in the front to kind of help with steerage. But compared to the more modern sailing ships, this made tacking very difficult, and it required them to travel much longer tacks. And so, so a trip that would normally take maybe 2 weeks, if the winds were favorable, would take 2 months. And so you can see the challenge that they were faced with here. So the ship sails from Sidon and they head for Myra. So they left Sidon, which is about here, and they ended up in Myra, which is right about in here. Okay, so
Did they go straight across, or?
no, they followed the coast.
That's
They
right.
followed the coast because, like I said, the ship was a coaster. It was a very small ship. Now, but Luke doesn't mention any stops along the way, but at least Syrian Antioch was a usual stop. But because of the northwest winds during that time, they had to use the island of Cyprus right here as a windbreak. Okay, and that's what it means by sailing under the lee of an island. Okay, you're sailing on the downwind side, so that the island is breaking the wind. Now this Myra was an important port of call for grain ships that were sailing from Egypt to Rome. And this is how they would travel. They would travel up here, and this was an important stop because they would unload a lot of grain right here. And then they would travel on, and they would end up in Rome. And they hauled lots of grain, and Egypt in those days supplied about 1/3 to 1/2 of Rome's wheat supply.
Oh,
So, so they get on board and off they go, but they're going slow because of the prevailing northwest winds. And after passing Cnidus, which is right about in here, it's out on the end of one of these peninsulas, after passing by here, the winds were contrary, and they were forced to sail on the lee side of the island of Crete, right here. And they couldn't cross this way because the winds were blowing them south. Okay, so they ended up there, and they were using Crete as a windbreak. And here they're forced to make some decisions. Now this Salmone is on the eastern tip of the island, and Fairhavens is in the middle of the southern shore, right about in here someplace. Okay. Now, we need to read on. Matt, you want to take 9 through 12?
Yeah. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But Centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest.
So they put in at Fairhaven, which really, the port itself actually wasn't all that bad, and it would have been a fairly safe place for them to spend the winter, but the town was a really small fishing village, and it wasn't a great place to have to spend all the winter months. And so, now remember that Paul had quite a bit of experience on sailing ships. In fact, by this time, he'd already been shipwrecked 3 times. And because of the lateness of the year, the dangers of sea travel were getting worse and worse. And some of your passages here mention just a feast. And the feast there was probably a Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which in AD 59, which is when these events were taking place, occurred on our October 5th. Now, because of all this, Paul advised them not to continue. And it's obvious that this was his own wisdom and not what he'd heard from the Lord yet, because as we'll see, the Lord's going to tell him that no one will be lost on this voyage. Now, but he was overruled by the captain and the owner of the ship, and they knew by now they weren't going to make it to Rome this winter. But they had a better harbor in Fairhavens in mind, and it was the harbor of Phoenix, which is about another 50 miles west, right about in here someplace. Okay. And so it would have been maybe a day's travel. All right, dear 13 through 20, please.
Okay. And when a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had gained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close to inshore. Crete, is it Crete?
Crete.
Yeah. But before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Aquilo. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. And running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship boat under control. And after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor and so let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jetson the cargo. And on the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned.
So they get the winds they're looking for, that will get into Phoenix. It's a light south wind, and that light south wind is gonna allow them to stay close to the shore here. But the south wind doesn't hold, and it's replaced by, what was the word that, the kind of wind? Started with, I think started with E.
Let's see,
Verse 4,
4,
14,
14,
14.
Aquilo,
Okay. The-
Euroquilo.
You're right, and that word in the Greek actually literally means a northeast wind. So the wind shifted from the south wind, keeping them hugging the island, to a northeast wind which drove them away. Okay, so now Luke describes this wind as a tempestuous wind, which is a translation of the Greek word from which we get the word typhoon. And so the wind is so strong, it becomes impossible to tack into it. And so they're left with no choice but to turn and run before the wind. And as they get pushed farther south toward the island of Cauda, which is about 25 miles off the southern coast of Crete, and they're unable to make any of the ports on the island, but they manage to get to the lee side of it. And this break allows them to get their lifeboat on board. Now this lifeboat is a good-sized rowboat that's usually towed behind. And the difficulty in getting it on board was that it was filling with water. And if they're unable to get it on board, they were going to lose it. So, and these sailing ships, those days were made of wood, and in a storm, they could take really a severe pounding, and the danger was that they would break up. And so the one thing that the sailors did to prevent this was something called frapping. And they would take lines and they would put them over the bow of the ship and let them coast back, and then they would snug them up, and it would tighten the outside boards of the ship against the ribs, and that would keep the ship from breaking up and giving more strength. And being in this slight lull by being in the lee of the island there gave them the opportunity to do this. Now, one of the dangers that Luke mentions here is something called the Syrtis, and apparently this is an area. It was an area in this area right in here that, or actually from here over, it's actually from here over, and apparently the continental shelf of North Africa right here is very shallow and extends a long way out. And once a ship gets into that area, the currents are very strong, the winds are contrary, and there's lots and lots of sandbars. And so when a ship gets into that area, it almost always ends in a shipwreck. And so, and although this is some 300 miles away, the storm that they're in is so strong that they considered a real possibility that they could end up there. Now this is on day 1 of the storm, but the storm doesn't let up, and by day 2 they're throwing bags of grain overboard. Now one of the reasons they're doing that is because when the grain gets wet it swells, and then it would expand against the sides of the ship. And so, and also, wind and violent storm, they want to try to ride a little higher, to keep the waves from going over the gunnels.
They weren't just throwing it out?
Yeah, they were throwing it out. They were throwing it clear out.
Okay.
Yeah, they're throwing it overboard.
And
Yeah, and on day 3, they're tossing the ship's rigging over the side. Now this is really a last ditch do or die situation. Meaning if they don't do this, they're for sure gonna die. And if they do it, they might die. So that's the situation that they're in right now. Now fortunately, or providentially for them, the storm didn't drive them to the southwest toward the Syrtis, it drove them west. But they didn't know any of this because GPS satellites weren't in orbit yet, and they didn't even have compasses. All they had was the sun and the stars, and they couldn't see any of that from the storm. And so really they thought they were headed for the coast of Africa and certain shipwrecked, but they weren't. They were going west. But given all that, they considered their situation as hopeless. At this point, they knew they were dead men. And so God has them right where He wants them. See, Matt, were you the last one to read? Who was the last one to read? You were here? Okay, Rick, you want to take 21 through 25?
After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have been spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." Last night an angel of God, whose I am and who I serve, stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, man, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me."
Okay, let's see, probably need to read one more verse.
One more.
Yeah. let's read
"Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island."
Right, so because they were in this storm, they were so busy and they were probably so worried and they were probably seasick and they hadn't eaten in a while. And so Paul kind of gives them this "I told you so."
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think this was intended as being haughtiness or being sarcastic. I think he was setting himself up as someone worth listening to. I think he was trying to give himself some credibility here. Now, the crewmen on this ship were most certainly not Jews, because Jews were not seafarers. And the crewmen might have had some knowledge of God, but probably not. And Paul tries to give them some encouragement, even though they're starving by now. And he tells them of this appearance by an angel of the Lord. And the angel's message is that no one is going to die. And Paul makes sure everyone on board knows it's capital G God who will do this, not Zeus or some other little g god. And there was a belief among Gentiles in those days that the gods would sometimes rescue ships for the sake of a righteous person or a devout person on board, but might sink a ship because of the presence of a wicked person. Now contrast the confidence and behaviors of Paul as compared to Jonah in similar circumstances. So how Paul had behaved toward the crew and others on the ship might have given the others cause for hope. Now, one never knows when their behavior will impact their witness, either for good or for bad. Now, although Caesar himself did not preside over most of the trials, his court would. But the angel assures Paul that he will give his opportunity to have his trial before Caesar. And this is actually a new revelation for Paul. All he'd been told previously by Jesus is that he would testify about him in Rome. Now, Paul finishes his pep talk here with the advice that they must run aground on some island. And I'm not sure this is from the angel or just Paul's wisdom here, but at any rate, good luck with it. And you're going to see how many islands there actually are out here. There really aren't very many at all. So hitting one of them is going to be like, trying to thread a needle. Now, notice that God doesn't tell them he's going to stop the storm, only that he'll get them through it. Because storms are nothing to God. Storms happen. And if he has a plan, the plan gets done. And really nothing can stand against him. And Paul reinforces this fact in his letter to the Romans from experience. Matt, do you have Romans 8:31?
Yeah. "What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us?"
Okay, so and now the more we experience God in our lives, the more we know this to be true. Right, Chris, I think we're back to you. 27 through 32, please.
27 through 32?
Yes.
All right. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, They dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt, to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the boat. Then Paul said to the centurion, "The soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away.
According to experts, being blown by a strong wind, it would take about 14 days to be blown from Crete to Malta. So that's pretty accurate here. Can you imagine being driven by a storm for 2 whole weeks?
Oh my gosh.
So, and then on that 14th night, they have this little drama. Now, these soundings were taken by a rope with weights tied to it in certain intervals, and they would just drop it over the side. Some of your versions say fathoms instead of feet. And a fathom is 6 feet. So in Chris's version there, they did the math already for you.
Yeah, no, I realized that they would not have done it in feet, or it's just, yeah.
But anyway, the point here is the indication is that they're rapidly getting closer to land. So, because it's shallowing here. But it was dark, and they weren't able to see very well, and they feared they might be nearing the shore, and they didn't want to end up on the rocks. And so they anchored the ship by the stern to hold them off. And normally, the ship is anchored from the bow, but they wanted to position themselves with the bow pointed toward the land, so in the morning they could just cut the anchors loose and point themselves right up into the land. Paul sensed that the crew was trying to save themselves by sneaking off in the only lifeboat that they had, and so he convinced the centurion of this. Now, without any experienced crewmen on board, they would have had no way to sail the ship to a safe grounding, and so they cut the boat loose. Okay, Matt 33 through 37.
Okay. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, "You have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged to make some food themselves, although there were 276 of us on board.
Sorry, one more.
Okay. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea.
So, facing a day Paul knows is going to be pretty challenging, and considering the circumstances, he suggests that they eat something to keep up their strength. They had a stressful and demanding 2 weeks without eating, and they were no doubt pretty drained. And he also encourages them with a reminder that everyone is going to survive this. And Paul starts the ball rolling by thanking the God who had gotten him through the storm thus far, and by having a bite to eat himself. And this prompted the rest of them to eat all they needed. Now, this number 276 does not appear in all the ancient documents. Some say 76 and some say about 76. So the total really isn't certain, but some commentators claim that some of these cargo ships were large enough to accommodate that and many more. I heard one commentator even mentioned up as many as 600 people could get on one of these ships. So that larger number is possible. Now, the reason for lightening the ship by tossing out the wheat was to get the ship, like I said before, to ride higher in the water, and that would help make it harder for the waves to wash over the guns, over the sides of the ship. And it would give the ship more clearance if they had to go over a reef, and would allow them to get closer to the shore before they grounded. Okay, 39 through 44 here.
Okay, and when day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a certain day the beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosing the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were heading for the beach. But striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, that none of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks, and others on various things from the ship. And thus it happened that they all were brought safely to land.
So when they finally had enough light to see it after spending what must have been a pretty tense night, and they had no idea where they were. But lo and behold, there was a beach right there where they could ground the boat. What a coincidence. And this must have been a beautiful sight to them. So they ditched the anchors and they untied the two long steering oars that were on either side of the stern. And this allowed them to get closer to the beach before grounding. But they ran aground too far out to jump overboard and wade to shore. And since the bow was now stuck fast, the surf was pounding the stern, which could not rise up and fall with the waves, and it would, as it could have been if it were anchored. And the danger was the ship would be pounded to kindling. And since the soldiers were responsible for the prisoners and would suffer their fate if allowed to escape, they wanted to kill all the prisoners. But for some reason, the centurion wanted Paul to live. But it would have been unfair to allow Paul to live and kill all the others. And so all of them were spared. Now in this situation, it would have been very unlikely that everyone would make it safely to shore without divine intervention. And I think the implication here is that exactly what happened. And God was true to his promise. That's quite a testimony to God there. Okay, I want to stop there and we'll take up the very last chapter next time. Next time, the last chapter.